Section 4 of Racketty-Packetty House and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Racketty-Packetty House and Other Stories by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Surly Tim. Part 1. Sorry to hear my fellow workmen speak so disparaging of me. Well, master, that's as it may be, you know. Happen my fellow workmen I made a bit of mistake. Happen what seems like crustiness to them bean't so much crustiness as something else. Happen I might do my own bit of complaining too. You may not trust all you hear, mister. That's all I can say. I looked at the man's bent face quite curiously, and judging from its rather heavy but still not unprepossessing outline, I could not really call it a bad face, or even a sulky one. And yet both managers and hands had given me a bad account of Tim Hibblethwaite. Surly Tim, they called him, and each had something to say about his sullen disposition to silence, and his short answers. Not that he was accused of anything like misdemeanor, but he was glum-like, the factory people said, and a surly fellow, well deserving his name, as the master of the room had told me. I had come to Lancashire to take control of my father's spinning factory a short time before, being anxious to do my best towards the hands, and I often talked to one and another in a friendly way, so that I could better understand their grievances and remedy them with justice to all parties concerned. So in conversing with men, women, and children, I gradually found out that Tim Hibblethwaite was in bad odour, and that he held himself doggedly aloof from all, and this was how, in the course of time, I came to speak to him about the matter. And the opening words of my story are the words of his answer, but they did not satisfy me by any means. I wanted to do the man justice myself, and see that justice was done to him by others. And then again, when, after my curious look at him, he lifted his head from his work and drew the back of his hand across his warm face, I noticed that he gave his eyes a brush, and glancing at him once more, I recognized the presence of a moisture in them. In my anxiety to conceal that I had noticed anything unusual, I'm afraid I spoke to him quite hurriedly. I was a young man then, and by no means as self-possessed as I ought to have been. "I hope you won't misunderstand me, Hibblethwaite," I said. "I don't mean to complain. Indeed, I have nothing to complain of, for Foxley tells me you're the steadiest and most orderly hand he has under him. But the fact is, I should like to make friends with you all, and see that no one is treated badly. And somehow or other I found out that you were not disposed to feel friendly toward the rest, and I was sorry for it, but I suppose you have some reason of your own." The man bent down over his work again, silent for a minute to my discomfiture, but at last he spoke almost huskily. "Thank you, mister," he said. "You're a kindly chap, or you wouldn't have noticed, and you're not very wrong either. I have reasons of my own, though I like to keep them to myself most of times. The fellers as throws their slurs on me would not understand 'em if I were like to gab, which I never were. But happen the time will come when Surly Tim will tell his own tale, though I often think it's like it won't not come till the day of judgment." "I hope it comes before then," I said cheerfully. "I hope the time is not far away when we shall all understand you, Hibblethwaite. I think it's been misunderstanding so far which has separated you from the rest, and it cannot last always, you know." But he shook his head, not after a surly fashion, but as I thought a trifle sadly or heavily, so I did not ask any more questions or try to force the subject upon him. But I noticed him pretty closely as time went on, and the more I saw of him, the more fully I was convinced that he was not so surly as people imagined. He never interfered with the most active of his enemies, nor made any reply when they taunted him, and more than once I saw him perform a silent, half-secret act of kindness. Once I caught him throwing half his dinner to a wretched little lad who had just come to the factory and worked near him, and once again, as I was leaving the building on a rainy night, I came upon him on the stone steps at the door, bending down, with an almost pathetic clumsiness, to pin the woolen shawl of a poor little mite, who, like so many others, worked with her shiftless father and mother to add to their weekly earnings. It was always the poorest and least cared for of the children whom he seemed to befriend. And very often I noticed that even when he was kindest, in his awkward man fashion, the little waifs were afraid of him and showed their fear plainly. The factory was situated on the outskirts of a thriving country town near Manchester, and at the end of the lane that led from it to the more thickly populated part, there was a path crossing a field to the pretty church and churchyard, and this path was a short-cut homeward for me. Being so pretty and quiet, the place had a sort of attraction for me, and I was in the habit of frequently passing through it on my way, partly because it was pretty and quiet, and partly because, I have no doubt, because I was inclined to be weak and melancholy at the time, my health being broken down under hard study. It so happened that in passing here one night, and glancing in among the graves and marble monuments as usual, I caught sight of a dark figure sitting upon a little mound under a tree, and resting its head upon its hands, and in this sad-looking figure I recognized the muscular outline of my friend Surly Tim. He did not see me at first, and I was almost inclined to think it best to leave him alone, but as I half turned away, he stirred with something like a faint moan, and then lifted his head and saw me standing in the bright, clear moonlight. "Who's there?" he said. "Dost thou want out?" "It's only Doncaster, Hibblethwaite," I returned, as I sprang over the low stone wall to join him. "What is the matter, old fellow? I thought I heard you groan just now." "You might ha' done, mister," he answered heavily. "Happen tha did. I done not myself. Not's the matter, though, as I knows on. Only I'm a bit out of sorts." He turned his head aside slightly, and began to pull at the blades of grass on the mound, and all at once I saw that his hand was trembling nervously. It was almost 3 minutes before he spoke again. "That 'un belongs to me," he said suddenly at last, pointing to a longer mound at his feet. "And this little 'un," signifying with an indescribable gesture the small one upon which he sat. "Poor fellow," I said. "I see now." "A little lad of mine," he said slowly and tremulously. "A little lad of mine and his mother." "What?" I exclaimed. "I never knew that you were a married man, Tim." He dropped his head upon his hand again, still pulling nervously at the grass with the other. "The law says I bean't, mister," he answered in a painful, strained fashion. "I cannot tell myself what God Almighty 'ud say about it." "I don't understand," I faltered. "You don't mean to say the poor girl never was your wife, Hibblethwaite?" "That's what the law says." Slowly. "I thowt different, my son, and so did the poor lass. That's what's the matter, mister. That's the trouble." The other nervous hand went up to his bent face for a minute and hid it, but I did not speak. There was so much of strange grief in his simple movement that I felt words would be out of place. It was not my dogged, inexplicable hand who was sitting before me in the bright moonlight on the baby's grave. It was a man with a hidden history of some tragic sorrow long kept secret in his homely breast. Perhaps a history very few of us could read or write. I would not question him, though I fancied he meant to explain himself. I knew that if he was willing to tell me the truth, it was best that he should choose his own time for it, and so I let him alone. And before I had waited very long, he broke the silence himself, as I had thought he would. "It were welly about 6 year ago I come here," he said, "more or less, welly about 6 year. I were a quiet chap then, mister, and had not many friends, but I had more 'n I ha' now. Happen I were better natured, but just as loike I were lighter hearted, but that's not to do with it. I had not been here more than a week when there come a young woman to mind the loom in the next room to me, and this young woman, being pretty and modest, takes my fancy. She were not like the rest of the wenches, loud talking and slattern ill ways. She were just quiet like, and naught else. First time I seed her, I says to mysen, 'There's a lass at seed trouble,' And somehow, every time I seed her after, I says to myself, there's a lass at seed trouble. It were her eye. She had a soft, like brown eye, mister, and it were her voice. Her voice were soft like, too. I sometimes thought it were plain to be seed, even her dress. If she'd been born a lady, she'd have been one of the fine sort, and as she'd been born a factory lass, she were one of the fine sort still. So I took to watching her, and trying to make friends with her, but I never had much luck with her, till one night I was going home through the snow, and I seed her afore tighten the drift with naught but a thin shawl o'er her head. And so I goes up behind her, and I says to her, steady and respectful, so she wouldn't be afeard, I says, lass, let me see thee home. It's bad weather for thee to be out in by thysen. Take my coat, and wrap thee up in it, and take hold of my arm, and let me help thee along. She looks up right straight forward in my face with her brown eyes, and I tell you, mister, I were glad I were a honest man, 'stead of a rascal, for them quiet eyes 'ud have fun me out before I'd have done saying my say, if I'd have meant harm. Thank you kindly, Master Hibblethwaite, she says, but do not take off the coat for me. I'm doing pretty nicely. It is Mr. Hibblethwaite, bean't it? Ay, lass, I answers, it's him. Mought I ax your name? Ay, to be sure, said she. My name's Rosanna. Sanna Brent, the folk at the mill always calls me. I work at the loom next room to thine. I've seed thee often and often. So we walks home to her lodgings, and on the way we talks together friendly and quiet like, and the more we talks the more I sees she's had trouble, and by, being only common working folk, we're straightforward to each other in our plain way. It comes out what her trouble has been. You p'raps wouldn't think I've been a married woman, mister, she says, but I ha, and I wedded and rued. I married a sojer when I were a giddy young wench 4 years ago, and it were the worst thing as ever I did in all my days. He were one of your handsome, fastish chaps, and he tired of me as men of his stripe always do, tire o' poor lasses, and then he ill-treated me. He went to the Crimea after we'd been wed a year, and left me to shift for myself, and I heard 6 months after he were dead. He never writ back to me, nor sent me no help, but I could not think he were dead till the letter come. He were killed the first month he were out fighting the Roosians. Poor feller, poor Phil, the Lord have mercy on him. And that were how I found out about her trouble, and somehow it seemed to draw me to her and make me feel kindly towards her. 'Twas so pitiful to hear her talk about the rascal, so sorrowful and gentle, and not give him a real hard word for what he'd done. But that's always the way with woman folk. The more yo harry of them, the more they pity yo and pray for yo. Why, she wasn't more than 22 then. She must have been naught but a slip of a lass when they were wed. Howsever, Rosanna Brent and me got to be good friends, and we walked home together at nights, and talked about our bits of wage and our bits of debt, and the way that wench should keep up her spirits when I were a bit downhearted about out were just a wonder. She was so quiet and steady, and when she said out, she meant it, and she never said too much or too little. Her brown eyes always reminded me of my mother, though the old woman deed when I was no but a little chap. But I never seed Sanna Brent smile without thinking of how my mother looked when I were kneeling down saying my prayers after her. And being as the lass were so dear to me, I made up my mind to ax her to be somewhat dear. So once, going home along with her, I takes hold of her hand and lifts it up and kisses it gentle as with somewhat the same feeling as I'd kiss the good book. Sanna, I says, being as you've had so much trouble with your first chance, would you be afeard to try a second? Could you trust a mon again, such a mon as me, Sanna? I wouldn't be feared to trust thee, Tim, she answers back soft and gentle after a manner. I would not be feared to trust thee any time. I kisses her hand again, gentler still. God bless thee, lass, I says. Does that mean yes? She crept up closer to me in her sweet, quiet way. Ay, lad, she answers, it means yes, and I'll bide by it. And thou shalt never rue it, lass, said I. Thou's given thy life to me, and I'll give mine to thee, sure and true. So we were axed i' the church the next Sunday, and a month fra then we were wed, And if ever a God's sun shone on a happy mon, it shone on one that day, when we come out of church together, me and Rosanna, and went to our bit of a home to begin life again. I couldna tell thee, mister, there bean't no words to tell how happy and peaceful we lived for 2 year after that. My lass never altered her sweet ways, and I just loved her to make up to her for what had gone by. I thank God Almighty for his blessing every day, and every day I prayed to be made worthy of it. And here's just where I'd like to ask a question, mister, about some 'at's worried me a good deal. I do not want to question the Maker, but I would like to know how it is 'at sometimes it seems 'at's we're clean forgot, as if he couldna fash his'n about our troubles, and most like left 'em to work out their sins. You see, mister, and we all see sometimes he thinks on us and gives us a lift, but has not thysen seen times when thou stopped short and asked thysen, where's God Almighty, 'at he isna straighten things out a bit? The world's i' a power of snarl, the righteous is forsaken, in his seeds begging bread, and the devil's topmost again. I've talked to my lass about it sometimes, and I do not think I meant harm, mister, for I felt humble enough, and when I talked, my lass, she'd listen and smile, soft and sorrowful, but she never give me but one answer. End of section 4.